Hi everyone, today we're going to be exploring doing deep curves, and we're going to do a heart and a dragonfly. And one thing you'll notice pretty quickly is that this is very much like the leaf shapes. We're going to be doing deep curves by cutting them up into pieceable parts. So to do the heart, you're going to need 2 pieces of fabric. You could do more, but when you're just trying out a new shape, sometimes 2 is good enough. And we're going to cut it in half. And when I first started exploring free cut piecing, I made a quilt where I just cut this in one curve. That was really hard to piece. And then I realized I needed to break that curve up into pieces. And so I'm going to do a heart shape here. I'm going to, instead of doing the curve all the way around, I'm going to go off my fabric about like that, because I want to have not a point this time, I want something kind of rounded. And make sure you leave enough space on this side and on this side for seam allowance. And then down here you want to leave room for your seam allowance too. And then cut up here into kind of an attractive heart shape. It's not going to be perfectly round, but it will definitely read as a heart. And we can ignore, oh, well actually we should cut this part too. So the best way to do this is to just flip this piece over to use as a pattern. And I think how you cut this is very much dependent on your handedness. So from a right-hander, I'm going to start over here and then go over here. It might be different if you're left-handed. You might want to do this a little differently. Anyway, like that. Okay, so and what you notice here is order of piecing. So this was cut 1, this was cut 2, and this was cut 3. So, and then 4 and 5 over here. So we know that we want to piece these 2 pieces together because this was our second cut. So we're going to do it just like the leaves. We're going to flip this over on the top and get 1 pin in there. Oh, I guess I have one of these. And again, I'm just going to lay this out in my hand to see where to start and stop sewing. So just like with a leaf, you just want to lay this out and see if you have a good amount of fabric in there. A good amount meaning that you're not going to get any tufts or bumps in there. And then sew with your between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch. We've got this, and then we're going to do the pieces that were made by cut 3. And I always check to make sure my curves are still matching, but they really are on this piece. That I kind of visually check every time, because if those curves didn't match, as they probably won't when we get into the dragonfly, then you want to layer the fabrics over each other and recut. And here I would like my heart to stand up from the background, so I'm going to want my seam allowance to go this way. So I think my square, I think, was 9 inches to start out with. You can make these really tiny or really gigantic, but for your first time out, a 9-inch square is pretty good. You could make tall, skinny hearts by cutting them that way. Just always make sure you allow on the edges for seam allowance. Okay, so this is the part we have, and then you would repeat that with all the other pieces, and you end up with hearts like this. And you could either sew them together with the matching thing. Now see, we've got some weird stuff happening here, and you know by now that what you'd want to do is layer these back up and recut this seam so that the edges match to sew them together so that everything will lie flat. Or I have another option, is that I could split them and sew them together like this, and again I'd need to recut this line to make sure those edges match each other perfectly. And this is actually, which you'll find when you do it, this is a pretty easy block to make, and it's good for gifts because who doesn't like hearts? So the next thing we're going to work on is something that's a little more elaborate. And when I have even though dragonflies are among my favorite insects, I have a hard time doing the wings gracefully. So I've done up a paper pattern, and my pattern is smaller than my fabric because I want to, later on I'm going to want to insert a body in here using this insertion technique. And if you do use a paper pattern, make sure you make a copy of your pattern, because once you cut it up, you need a pattern to be able to go back and follow your cuts. And oftentimes on a complex design, I will number my cuts on there depending how I'm going to do it, just to help you keep track in case you get interrupted. So again, I'm going to start cutting by cutting in half and getting this one out of the way. And it doesn't matter whether you start at the bottom or the top. I think again that's dependent on handedness. And I've drawn this very curvy thing, but again, I'm going to be cutting these wings up for ease of piecing, because when you break that curve up, it makes them into going from a sharp curve into basically two slightly curved lines. So go up and start your curve, and then go right off your pattern, and then get this piece out of the way. So that was cut 1, cut 2. Do cut 3. Cut 4. And cut 5. And then you would repeat this on the other half of the insect. And so you always want to piece it back together the opposite way of which you cut. There could be other ways too, but that's the simplest way to remember how to piece your things back together. Okay, so I'm going to sew these onto this. Again, because I'm using batiks and hand dyes in this block, you want to be careful that the wind doesn't blow these pieces upside down. But if they do, you just need to build your puzzle back together and make sure that all your pieces line up. I'm going to put the one pin in. And again, I like to sew with this side on top because it's stretchiest. Even though this is a batik and there's not a lot of stretch in here. Good to keep your edges together if you can. If you have needle down on your machine, be sure to use it because it makes life easier. So this is where I'm going to go and check to see if my curves are still matching. And if they're not, I'll do something about it. Let's see. Oh yeah, this has to go over here. It's a little off there, but I think it'll be fine. I'm thinking my curves are a little bit different here, and on this one I want to maintain that nice curve around there, so I'm going to scooch this down a little bit, and you can see these don't match up quite the same, so I'm just going to cut again here. Sometimes you won't need to. There's so many odd angles in this, it's hard to predict. But because we know we always want our edges to match, we just make sure of that. Again, hold it in your hand and see. You might have to stretch that bias edge just a little bit, but you don't want to abuse it, just use it. And so to your pin. Okay, that's pretty good. Yay. So one thing you'll notice, this is making dragonflies that are very simple and plain. So when your feet cut piecing, you can achieve good basic simple shapes, but to add detail, you're going to want to use other techniques like couching, hand or machine embroidery, or applique. Fusible applique is a great way. Sometimes I've used beads or buttons to add details. Using couched yarns is lots of fun, and I enjoy it a lot. So one thing I've done when I've made dragonflies in the past is layer a sheer sparkly fabric on top of another fabric, and fusing that lightly, and then using that in the layer for the dragonfly wings. I like a little bit of bling. So we get this black, and I would run over to the ironing board and piece it up. And what we're getting are these pieces. And as I said, I left this piece longer because I know that I'd want to do an insertion and insert the dragonfly body in here. I didn't really plan to do that for you, but you can see that you would do that by, as we know, you would sew another piece of fabric onto this side, you know, cut these the same size, and then you would overlap this over until you saw what you'd like to see in the finished product. And of course I'd want this to disappear down here, and then I'd use two really sparkly beads up here for their eyes. So lay it on, see what you want to see, scooch it out, recut that, you know, you sew it onto this one, then you layer this over here, recut this line just as we showed in the previous video, and then you get your insertion. So go and practice with that. And I'd love to get feedback from you. One thing in the intro video, I hoped that you would start looking around you at the things in your life and see if you can break them down into simple pieces that you could pre-cut piece. And I'd love to get some feedback to know if that's happening to you. Okay, and next time we're going to show about using pieced layers in your stack, and then also we'll get started on seeing how you assemble your units all into a beautiful piece. Okay, see you next time. Bye.